Hello and welcome to a breaking news episode of the Days of Roar podcast. I'm Evan Petzold, the Detroit Tigers beat writer for the Detroit Free Press. And for this bonus episode to discuss the result of Tarik Skubal versus the Detroit Tigers in a precedent-setting arbitration hearing, I'm joined by former Detroit Tigers Director of Baseball Operations, Mike Smith, who worked 15 years in MLB front offices, including in the Tigers front office from 2002 to 2015. Mike, thank you for joining me for this special breaking news episode. And before we get into things with Tarik Skubal, can you walk us through your experience with the Tigers for nearly 14 years, along with your involvement in salary arbitration throughout those years?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me, Evan. I'm happy to be here. I've been out of the game for 10 years, and this is the first week that anybody has actually cared about the salary arbitration process, which means for the first time, people are like, hey, Mike, can you share what's going on here? I was originally hired by the Marlins in 2000 as an intern, actually to prepare salary arbitration cases for the Dave Dombrowski, for John Westhoff and the Marlins. When that team got sold, I came up here to the Detroit Tigers with Dave Dombrowski and John, and that was my primary role for 15 years. And then how I added in like the other duties in Major League operations, from rules to pro scouting to analytics and all that stuff. How I grew was a 15-year journey, but arbitration was the job from year one and one that I held through year 15.
So we are here to talk about Tarik Skubal versus the Tigers in a historic arbitration case. The arbitration hearing in front of a 3-person arbitration panel occurred Wednesday, and the decision from the panel came Thursday. The winner, Tarik Skubal, beat the Tigers in salary arbitration, securing his $32 million proposed salary instead of the Tigers' $19 million proposed salary. The $13 million difference, it marked the largest gap in the history of MLB's arbitration system. But Skubal won the case. He secured $32 million, which is a new record in salary arbitration. For an arbitration-eligible player, it's exactly $1 million more than Juan Soto's $31 million in a settlement with the New York Yankees in 2024. So Skubal wins $32 million. The Tigers essentially lose out on the $13 million difference. What was your initial reaction when you saw the result of this arbitration case?
I can tell you, had either side won, I wouldn't have been surprised. There's so many things that go into it. There's both the actual factors of what each side is arguing. And in this case, they are not arguing the same thing. They're arguing very different philosophies. One is all the comparables and all the history of players who've ever signed in arbitration as the pitchers. That favors the club side. And on the player side, that was 11 years ago. There's been inflation. The market's been reset. Pitchers have fallen behind hitters in the salary structure. We need to catch them up. And we need to properly reflect them vis-a-vis somebody who's won the Cy Young 2 years in a row, which has never happened in arbitration. And, as a percentage of like where free agent salaries are. So obviously we don't know the reasons why, but the arbitrators chose the players' philosophical view of the world, and that neither outcome would have been surprising to me.
What actually happens in an arbitration hearing when you get these people in a room, these arbiters in the room? Like, what actually goes down?
So normally, each side gets an hour to present its case. The players go first, then the club. And then each side gets half an hour. The players would go first to rebut what the other side said. And often you have support from the union and the commissioner's office there in that moment to make more universal arguments about what's going on in baseball vis-a-vis salaries. And then there's a very short 5-minute rebuttal to rebut people's rebuttals. Normally, this is where it gets pretty dirty. And the player talks about how they're the most amazing thing since sliced bread. And the club talks about all their deficiencies. There's not really any deficiencies to talk about. Tarik Skubal, the best pitcher in the game. I wasn't there, but the club's arguments are almost entirely going to be based on precedent-setting salaries and perhaps the lack of depth of Skubal's career. So career does matter as well. If you compare him to David Price had many more innings. Clearly that didn't carry the day as an argument, but I doubt that anything the Tigers said was particularly negative. So that probably helps their relationship still afterwards.
That's what I was going to ask you, because in this hearing, Tarik Skubal, he brought his Cy Young awards just in case, but he never had to show them. But I have heard horror stories about teams just picking apart players and then players getting upset with the teams. And, things can get pretty awkward. From my understanding, in this case, this was a heated but civil argument between people in Skubal's camp and people in the Tigers camp, and it was strictly business. So there shouldn't be any bad blood here on either side as we move forward. Can these hearings actually damage relationships?
They absolutely can. And there's stories of that's happening before. Now, if this was civil, what's the best outcome Skubal could possibly have had? Imagine he had a negotiated settlement last week at 26 million. Let's just call that the number. He had a relatively civil hearing and he won his case at 32 million. He's getting much more money than had they come to a negotiated settlement. So in terms of like the best outcome for him, if he still has a collegial relationship with the club and he has 32 million in his pocket, like Skubal's a winner today, all around. So we shouldn't, hopefully there's no strain, and I'd be shocked if there was.
You mentioned the word settlement there. When you first heard Skubal and the Tigers filed 13 million apart, Skubal at 32 million, the Tigers at 19 million, did you think the two sides would come to an agreement before the hearing? And when did it become apparent to you that a settlement wasn't going to happen?
It became apparent to me that a settlement wasn't going to happen when the hearing happened. We've been part of cases. I was part of cases where the first year I ever did this, we literally settled on the doorstep 5 minutes after the case was supposed to start. The very next year, we settled another case 10 minutes before the case was started. These cases can go right to the edge. When you get the agent and the club in person right before a hearing, sometimes those last minute conversations happen. So in this case, until the hearing happened, I thought there was still an opportunity for settlement. In this case, I think, again, going back to kind of the philosophical view of the world, if Skubal and Boris saw things different than the club, sometimes you just can't bridge those philosophical differences. And that's okay. Arbitration is meant to create a forum where when you can't reconcile those differences, you have independent arbitrators to figure it out for you.
The three arbitrators in this case, Jean Charles, Walt Detrue, and Alan Ponak, according to the Associated Press. Who are these types of people? What do they know about baseball? And how are they even selected for something like this? Because they're ultimately deciding 32 million or 19 million.
And this is very much like these are registered arbitrators in, I forget the exact name of the organization, but whatever the national organization is for arbitrators, they're part of that process. Normally they're talking giant cases with very convoluted arguments, detailed law, probably large finances, Fortune 500 companies. In this case, and in those cases, many days of hearings, sometimes they have to give very detailed opinions on why they chose one number or the other. In this case, they get to show up, rub elbows with the most famous players in the world, and then a day later come out with a result where they don't have to give any explanation for what happens. Now, what's going to happen next year? Is the commissioner's office going to dismiss all three of those arbitrators from this really choice job? We don't know. We'll find out next year. But each side, the commissioner's office and the union, have the right to keep or dismiss arbitrators every year, which kind of keeps the arbitrators having another reason to decide, relatively equal both for the club and player over the long term, who they want to support. Because if they get too many cases for the club or too many cases for the players, the commissioner's office or the union will kick them off next year.
You mentioned you never really know what to expect from these type of cases, really across the board. But from what I understand about what happened in Wednesday's hearing, and I don't know everything, but from what I do understand, the Tigers tried to compare Tarik Skubal with past arbitration-eligible players, whereas Skubal's agent, Scott Boras, argued that Skubal deserved $32 million because of an exception in the collective bargaining agreement that allows arbitration-eligible players with at least 5 years of service time to compare themselves to all players, not just arbitration-eligible players, all players. And Skubal has 5 years of service time, actually has more than that. So he was able to do that. In this case, Skubal did not have any current comparable salaries. I mean, find me a back-to-back Cy Young winner in the final year of arbitration eligibility. So without any current comparables, Skubal built his case around starting pitchers making more than $40 million. So guys like Zach Wheeler, Jacob deGrom, Garrett Cole, and seemingly that's how he won the case. That's my understanding of how things went down, but you're the expert. Like, does all that make sense as to why Skubal won, or at least why he was able to present a compelling case?
It absolutely is. And this is the philosophical argument that his side likely put forward, is saying, listen, the pitcher market in 2015 with David Price is very different than it is now in 2026. The free agent salaries have spiraled and skyrocketed. We are in arbitration. We know that we can't get one-to-one salary comparisons between those free agents, but the ratio of what a 5+ player gets compared to free agents remains relatively constant. So now they're arguing, well, the top free agent salaries are 42, 43 million. If you believe I'm worth more than 2/3 of that, the 26 or the 25, the 26.5, no, that's right, 25.5 midpoint, then you have to find in favor of me. And it's a hard argument to make in the sense of There's no exact relationship between 5+ players and free agents, but the inflation argument is very powerful. It certainly helps that you have a rarefied pitcher, like the next guy who comes along that wins 2 Cy Youngs in his 5+ season of arbitration, maybe 50 years from now, maybe never. So this is such a unique case that they are able to argue that. And maybe they're arguing that it really doesn't affect that many other players. And you arbitrator can make a historic decision knowing that it's not blowing up the universe of salary arbitration.
Well, there is one player coming up soon that it could affect, and that's Paul Skeens. I'm curious because not only did Skubal become the highest paid arbitration eligible player in MLB history at $32 million, but he also surpassed David Price's $19.75 million from 2015, as you've referenced, as the largest arbitration salary for a pitcher. And he got a nearly $22 million raise, which surpassed Jacob deGrom, who got a $9.6 million raise in 2019. That was the largest raise for a pitcher until Skubal shattered that. So a lot of records were broken, and we'll get into the CBA, but if the system stays the same, what could this case mean for the future of arbitration, both for pitchers in their first and second years? Does it impact them at all? But more importantly, for pitchers in their third and final year of arbitration, and I mentioned Paul Skeens, I just keep thinking of how much could somebody like that make in 2029?
It will raise the ceiling for all pitchers slowly. You have to have some 5+ pitchers come in who can kind of bump their ceiling up a little bit towards Skubal. He's so unique that they can't make a very, very comparable argument. And then how that trickles down to the second time play arbitration eligible players. And then finally the first time. This will happen over time. But you also have a scenario where the hitter arbitration market has really increased since 2015. And the pitcher market hadn't. There was kind of a glass ceiling. And this was the opportunity to bring that pitcher market back into line with the hitter market. So I don't blame the commissioner's office side for really trying to hold that ceiling in line. Maybe that's to the detriment of the Tigers payroll, but it's a fight that I can see the commissioner's office being willing to fight. From a perspective of Paul Skeens, like the reason guys like Skubal don't come along very often is it's really hard to put together so many years of success in a row. So Paul Skeens still has quite a few years before he gets there, and he has to stay healthy every year. He has to be at the top of his game. I'd love to see it. One more point of comparison is Paul Skeens, if he ever gets this far, he'll probably, the number is actually more like, we know it's north of $25.5 million. When you get in an arbitration hearing, everybody knows Skubal's $32 million salary isn't the actual comparable number. It's somewhere between that midpoint and that $32 million. So it's not quite $32 million in terms of how other pitchers will look at it going forward.
You mentioned the commissioner's office, and I've heard about MLB's labor relations department having a role in this, and maybe they push the Tigers into filing at $19 million and getting into this mess in the first place. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've heard. I am curious because I don't really understand how all this works from the inner workings. Why would the labor relations department be interested in this case, and what does that mean?
Both sides, the labor relations department and the union, help coordinate salaries. So the worst thing, let's take it more with a player like Spencer Torkelson. Torkelson's showing up with a lot of comparable players this year on many other teams. The labor relations department helps coordinate all those arbitration numbers together and acts as kind of an arbiter to say, like, listen, you may think your guy is better. We have a lot of history here. Here's how they normally line up. That really helps the coordination for both sides, because otherwise you have agents or clubs that may be way out of line with the way the rest of the universe sees it. And that's going to happen when people have different opinions. When it's an industry defining case like this, and the club may not have as much experience, and I'm not saying this about the Tigers, just in general, the more industry defining it is, the more the labor relations department and the union will have a very hands-on approach and exert their opinion and influence. And then it's up to each club. It's still their decision at the end, but that's something you have to wrestle with when you have professionals who do this all the time telling you their view of the world, and maybe you see it a little different.
So basically what you're saying is MLB's labor relations department may have nudged the Tigers and said, hey, 19 million is the number to file at, but ultimately it's the Tigers' decision whether or not they want to file at 19 or whether they want to file at 23, let's just say.
Right. And think about it this way. This was not a case that was decided by comparables. It was very much decided by philosophies. There's the philosophy of the comparables on the club side and the philosophy of the free agent in the market moving on the player side. Let's say the club had filed 21 million instead of 19 million. That would have moved the midpoint $1 million. Would that have mattered? Would any more comparables have changed? No, not at all. It's literally pretty much the exact same arguments. So is there a little optics of it being below 20 million as the club's filing number? Maybe. But both sides are really probably talking about that midpoint. So I don't personally find any fault in the Tigers filing 19 million. I don't think the midpoint changing by $1 million if they filed $2 million higher would have mattered. They were going to lose that argument, it seems, either way.
How do you expect this case to impact the upcoming collective bargaining agreement negotiations? As we know, the CBA expires December 1st, 2026. And from there, we could have another lockout unless MLB and the MLBPA agree to a new CBA. How will the Tarik Skubal arbitration case impact those negotiations, especially when words like salary cap and salary floor are going to be thrown around?
I don't know how much the case itself will matter. I know that I felt this all 15 years. Salary arbitration is an incredible waste of time and human resources on both sides. And why do we spend all this time preparing cases when maybe there's a formula that makes sense that both sides can agree to? You know, maybe arbitration is eliminated entirely. I've heard previous proposals over the years that, like, what if arbitration was eliminated and free agency players were eligible sooner? These kind of things will all be on the table. When I was in the game, I would have loved if arbitration was canceled because I spent so much time on it. And, you know, I looked at over 200 cases in my career. How many cases did I actually go to? 0. That is an enormous amount of human capital that could be spent on other things that would help your team get better.
That's really good stuff. Do you have any other thoughts on the arbitration process, Skubal's case, or kind of what this means for the future of the sport?
It's funny. The only person who's a quote unquote loser here is Chris Ilitch's wallet. If he's not going to trade Skubal and they keep him and Framber Valdez here together, like, for fans, for the club, on the field, for Tarik Skubal and the security for his family, like, everybody's a winner today. I don't think this has to be a negative opinion, except for perhaps when, you know, what the profitability line is for the Detroit Tigers.
All right, before we get out of here, I also want to ask you just your take on the Tigers' outlook for the 2026 season. Obviously, a lot of buzz right now with Tarik Skubal, Framber Valdez leading the way in that rotation, assuming the Tigers don't trade Skubal, which I'm not expecting they will trade him at this point. I think we're going to see the 1-2 punch of Skubal and Valdez. What is the potential for this Tigers team in 2026?
I think we're really living in a charmed time in Detroit Tigers history. Making the playoffs 2 years in a row, having the wins go from 86 to 87, now adding Valdez. This is a great time to be a fan. For me, I look going into the offseason at, like, everybody was frustrated by the offense for the last 2 months. Well, that same offense for the first 3 months was gangbusters. The truth of what this offense is somewhere in the middle. And what the front office has done a great job at is creating an offense where every position has a mediocre floor at worst. That is great. It means you're never going to have a total zero on the field. The downside of that is the cost to upgrade the offense is enormous. If you spend, let's call it 38 million on Bo Bichette, you're going to go from 86 wins to 88 wins. However, if you spend that exact same amount of money on Framber Valdez, that's worth going from 86 wins to 90 wins. It was very obvious to me that at the start of the offseason, at least, had it been my pick, I would have targeted a high-end starting pitcher better than Jack Flaherty and better than Casey Mize. It was the biggest weakness I saw. Every team needs 10 to 11 starters during the year, and the Tigers were really one short. If you look back at, I've taken looks at this, I can't help myself still. You look back at 2024, they spent 38 starts on Maeda, Cater Montero, and Matt Manning to basically get replacement level pitching. In 2025, they spent 28 starts on Montero, Morton, and Paddock. Knowing that, now you get Framber Valdez, 25, 30 starts. You know these guys are going to get hurt. You know if Melton doesn't start the season in the rotation or even in the major leagues, he's still going to get 20, 25 starts by the end of the year because every year the team needs this kind of depth. I think they addressed their absolute number one need and that they were smart not to upgrade the offense because they have McGonigal coming, they have Clark coming, they have Anderson, they have Lee. They have all these hitters. They don't know exactly who's going to step forward at what position, but they've given themselves a lot of flexibility to buy a little more time, not to block anyone, to make the most massive upgrade they can over a position that once you get to the 8th, 9th, 10th starters of the year, Framber Valdez's signing really pushes those guys down a lot.
It's time to get excited, everyone. 5 days until pitchers and catchers report to spring training. That's all we have for this bonus episode on the Days of Roar podcast. Thank you to former Detroit Tigers executive Mike Smith for joining. And as always, thanks to our producer, Robin Chan, for putting in the extra work to edit and publish this episode. Check back for our regular hour-long episode, which drops Monday or Tuesday. And until then, go in peace.